Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Max Blumenthal. You're in the Grayzone. It's another Grayzone Friday live stream, and this one's going to be really good. I'll have Aaron Mate joining us in a minute, but right now I want to talk about what's been happening in East Palestine, Ohio, because it relates to the larger discussion and the priorities of this administration, which has taken a supposedly secret trip to Ukraine. That's the Biden administration. On February 3rd, a train derailed in the small, quaint town of East Palestine, Ohio, which sits between Pittsburgh and Youngstown, the heart of the Rust Belt. And the train was carrying vinyl chloride. Toxic chemicals were leaking from the train tracks. They remained on the train tracks for 2 days. And in order to clear those tracks so that it can continue to make profits, the company that controlled that train, Norfolk Southern, conducted what it called a controlled ventilation. And that meant that it detonated the train and the tracks, this poison-filled train, with explosives, and created a gigantic explosion that filled the town with debris. Reporter and Grayzone contributor Jeremy Lafredo has been in East Palestine, and what he encountered is a town overrun with fear, where rivers are polluted to the point where nothing can live in them. The entire riverbed has been polluted, and it's possible that this toxic disaster can spread well beyond East Palestine. We also want to talk about, so we're going to bring in Jeremy right now, and we also want to talk about the political implications, as Donald Trump, the former president, has visited East Palestine while Joe Biden was in Kiev, promising billions and billions more of U.S. tax dollars to Ukrainian warlords. So, Jeremy, welcome to the Grayzone. Great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, what were your first impressions when you arrived in East Palestine? We'll play some of your interviews, but tell me what stood out to you.
Sure. When I arrived there, I mean, it seemed like a normal, rural town. It's a village, actually. They'll correct you if you call it a town. It's a village. It only has 4,000 people. Just driving around, I noticed that a lot of the stores were closed. I would say half of the stuff downtown was just closed. And, there was this, thick dust in the air. There was still this white, debris flowing everywhere, which was, from after the explosion, all these burnt chemicals, they created a dust that kind of covered the town almost like a thin layer of, a dusting of snow. And they're told that, all this dust is safe, and no one that I spoke to really believed that. And as I was still driving around, I noticed, a lot of the roads were blocked off because they're cleaning up still. And, speaking to people, nobody felt like they were being taken care of by either the federal government or the local government. They thought that the train company was, kind of running the show, and they were very skeptical. And from even before the explosion, they felt like the directions and the guidance that they were getting from the authorities was, either lacking or contradictory. They were told, you don't have to evacuate. You do have to evacuate. Everything's safe. Everything's not safe. Everything's safe. It kind of terrorized them for, it still is right now, but especially those few days. So that's what I noticed when I first got there, just this feeling of terror that everyone was experiencing.
And how extensive was the pollution and the effect on wildlife? I saw some video you shot of dead frogs in the riverbed around East Palestine.
Of course. I mean, just driving around, it didn't seem like, anything catastrophic had happened. But then you speak to people and they say, you see this dust that's everywhere? It's not a dusty town. We don't normally have this everywhere. This is all from the explosion. And then it sort of opened my eyes to how widespread this, this pollution and this debris actually was. Since there were so many roadblocks, I decided, I'm going to go a little outside of the town and just go to a creek. And, within seconds, from 15 feet away, I could see these little white things that were on the bottom of the riverbed. And I got a little closer and I saw that it was fish and frogs and more fish and dead earthworms, and nothing was living. There was, almost a gray type of algae that covered the entire bottom of the riverbed and all of the dead things. It was just a big graveyard of wildlife, and that was, maybe 2 miles outside of town, and which is interesting because the evacuation parameter was only a mile. So this is, dead wildlife 2 miles away. Who knows, how much further that goes.
So what is the Center for Toxicology and Environmental Health? This strange group has showed up in the town to tell everyone that everything is okay.
Yeah. So you get into the town, and there's the welcome sign is being used for another purpose. The East Palestine welcome sign is actually being used to direct everyone to toxicologists, but not independent toxicologists that are from Norfolk Southern. And who is helping Norfolk Southern is this Center for Toxicology and Environmental Health, or CTEH. And they have a really speckled past, really controversial firm, and they're privatizing and contracting out this work of making sure everyone's safe. But this company, according to the New York Times, I tweeted this. The New York Times spoke to a toxicologist that's familiar with the firm's work, and they said that the firm's tests are designed to meet the goals of its clients. He said, quote, "They're paid to say everything's okay." So that's who is doing the testing in the town, telling everyone that everything is going to be okay and everything's safe. Meanwhile, they see this debris in front of their face. They're told that these chemicals were toxic. They see the dead everything. I spoke to many people who have animals that were lethargic or not eating in the beginning. They found dead skunks or dead raccoons just dead on their front lawn in the middle of the day, or convulsing in their front yard. It's clear to them that everything's okay and they're being lied to. And you actually have, in 2010, Representative Lewis Capps and Representative Peter Welch. They called for BP oil giant to end their contract with CTEH,
Right.
Because they had a history of supplying insufficient data that served the, quote, corporate interests of their clients rather than protecting public health. So this is who's protecting East Palestine.
Okay, and then we have a disastrous situation where people are essentially being told everything's okay, but they know it's not. People are describing, burning lungs, a terrible smell still in the air. And here's an interview you did with the small business owner, Bob Figley, who's talking about how ruinous the destruction was and what might come next. And I think, this is highly pertinent to the wider discussion we're having today about Ukraine.
So with all of this uncertainty and all this toxicity and unknown, how do we live here? And if you want to move from here, how do you sell your property? Who's going to buy it? Would it become a ghost town at some point? There's all these questions we ask. Here's my question. Is BlackRock going to come in and buy all this? I mean, we've got a large...
Is BlackRock going to come in and buy all this? Because so many people are talking about having to leave.
Yeah, and their property values, just you have weeks and weeks of the mainstream media and the independent media and everyone likening, using East Palestine and toxic, carcinogenic, and using all these words together. And the town has essentially all of their property values. They're afraid that all of their property values have just plummeted, and the entire wealth of this town has essentially gone down the drain with this, explosion. So they're afraid that, these, financial titans are going to come in and buy everything for cheap. And, this is a place where they've lived their entire lives and they have a real sense of community. So that's something that really scares them.
And we know that that BlackRock has partnered with Vladimir Zelensky under the Advantage Ukraine austerity program to basically come in and leverage Ukraine's massive debt to take over distressed Ukrainian property, which is going to be everywhere after the war. So I thought that was an interesting connection. You've also documented the presence of private police in the town, kind of like Pinkerton style cops who appear to be controlled by Norfolk Southern and have been given jurisdiction over the entire town. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I was interviewing somebody who worked at a hardware store, and he was explaining how one of the police officers identified himself as Norfolk PD. And he said, the closest Norfolk is in Virginia. And I said, well, you think it's Norfolk Southern? And he said, I think it is Norfolk Southern. So I looked it up. Norfolk Southern Police Department is a real thing. They're entirely funded by and directed by Norfolk Southern, the corporation. And, this town, which is not more than 1.5 miles wide, has about 10 unmarked SUVs filled with NSPD officers. And they have little police patches on their shirt without name identification. And they're driving all around the town. And you ask the people who are manning these public roadblocks, who's giving them direction to block these roads off. And they say, well, those black SUVs, Norfolk Southern PD. And we had a resident call the local police department and ask when the roads will be open. And they said, Norfolk Southern is in charge, ask them. And they called the Ohio police, said Norfolk Southern in charge, ask them. So you have this Norfolk Southern PD, private police force, kind of overrun this town, taking jurisdiction over the local police, over the state police, closing down public roads, really ruining the people's lives in East Palestine. And they're out-of-staters, everybody knows each other in this little town. And now you have these big black unmarked SUVs rolling around telling everyone what to do. It's not a good sight, and it's not a good story.
So essentially the private company that's responsible for this disaster that everyone blames for it, for filling the air with polyvinyl chloride, is also enforcing the aftermath through its private police force.
That's exactly what's happening. Wait, let me just add this one. I talked to a man who he took a walk in the woods. It was public land, and he was just documenting the dead fish and stuff like that. And he was taking pictures of fish. This is on the 20th, so this is 4 days ago. And he left, and while he was on his way home, he noticed that he was being followed by one of these Norfolk Southern PD. And he made a turn, he made another turn, he made another turn. This NSPD officer followed him the entire time. And when he got home, the NSPD guy rolled down his window and, clearly took his cell phone out and took pictures of this man's license plate. So these people don't feel safe, with Norfolk PD around their town. They don't know who they are. They're following them around. That's what's happening, and they're responsible for all of this.
It's shocking. And remember that, after February 3rd, this was kind of kept under wraps by national media until it kind of blew up over a week later. And especially it was the Democrats in particular who are quiet, I assume, because this is Trump country, if I'm not incorrect. So the big FU from the Democrats to the Rust Belt of Ohio. Here's Joy Behar on The View, one of our finest minds.
Lay down regulation for a second, because it seems to me that the Republicans are obsessed with this notion of the free market, and they don't like a lot of regulations.
Because it means profit. When you deregulate, you get profit.
But I know.
Part of deregulation,
for example, there were very few plane
very
crashes.
Deep conversation.
Thank God. And that's because the industry is highly regulated. We have to pay for regulations and safety standards. Otherwise, where are we? We're all going to go up in flames.
Norfolk Southern gives as much to Democrats as Republicans. It's a very powerful lobby that is trying to block regulation. And this train, to Sarah's point, 2 miles long with 2 full-time employees and a trainee on it. This
and
is
they didn't
that
even
wipe
need
out
to.
an entire...
Because the last administration rolled it down to only one worker. They happened to have 2.
One thing I just want to say is I do think this was an unforced error by President Biden. It was 20 days before we had Secretary Buttigieg go down, 10 days before he put out a statement acknowledging it. This is Trump country. He won by 40 points. He is a president for all Americans. I believe that, but he needs to show that he is. It was time for him to be.
I don't know why they would ever vote for him, because somebody who, by the way, he placed someone with deep ties to the chemical industry in charge of the EPA's Chemical Safety Office. That's who you voted for in that district. Donald Trump, who reduces all safety. He did in those days.
Showed up at McDonald's in those votes.
Basically, she's saying they deserve what they get. I mean, it took a while to get to that. I wish the clip had been shorter, but she's basically saying you deserve what you get because you voted for Donald Trump. And it is true. I mean, Donald Trump did vote to deregulate train braking in near populated areas. I mean, he was a tool of the railroad industry, as all Republican executives have been. But she's essentially saying you deserve what you get because you voted for him there.
Of course, and that argument, the it sort of misses the point. I mean, of course, deregulating the railroad industry, that's a bad idea. It's dangerous. There's derailments all the time, but it's not the derailment that caused most of this destruction and death. It was the corporate decision by the railroad company to set a bomb off in the middle of this town. And, the derailment, it's bad. It could have been solved. You could drain these cars carefully and pump these chemicals out of the cars, move the cars. It takes a while. It takes a good amount of time and effort. But the corporation just decided to line these cars with explosives and tell half of the residents, this is happening. Tell the other half you don't have to worry. Liken the toxic fire to, I believe they likened it to wood burning smoke, and they just blew it up. And they're still dealing with it a month later. It's not really. It's kind of missing the whole destructive act of setting a bomb off in the middle of this town when you talk about the derailment.
Okay. Just to recap, the train derailed, but that wasn't necessarily the issue. The issue is how the derailment was handled by the company. And that's
that's exactly.
So here's Pete Buttigieg. He finally arrives.
Good for him.
This is Pete Buttigieg of McKinsey. And, this is a right-wing or pro-Trump reporter, but it's a completely legitimate question to Buttigieg that he should have expected. And, I almost feel sorry for him. He got, he is the transportation secretary, but he had to take the fall because Biden wasn't going to go there. And this is not Biden country.
Mayor Pete, why did it take you an entire 2.5 weeks to actually get here to respond to East Palestine? Will you apologize to the residents of this city for the slow response, to the government's slow response? Do you have any apology?
I'm a press person. I can help you.
Sure. So can we ask why it took him almost 3 weeks to get here?
I'm sorry, I don't want to do this on camera.
What was his personal time off while there was a tragedy happening here?
And can we also ask too why he waited until President Donald Trump came here to actually make an appearance? This is a very important question that people across America would like to know.
I'm happy to have a conversation with you. I do not want to be on camera.
Well,
Please put your cameras away.
I'm sorry, we're on a public area, so we are allowed as press.
You guys, I would like you guys to turn your cameras off.
You're not on my camera.
Well, I'm on a camera. I would like your cameras to be off, and then I'm happy to talk to you guys.
Well, if you're the press secretary of the Department of Transportation, don't you think you should be able to ask questions from the American public that you serve?
Absolutely. I would like to do it without the camera on.
Can I ask why?
I think that is a little bit aggressive. That's why.
Why is it aggressive?
That's kind of wild.
The American people, I'm just asking.
And I guess you weren't there for Buttigieg, but what were people in the town saying about the Biden administration and about Joe Biden being in Ukraine to promise billions more to this completely unaccountable post-Maidan regime in Kiev while just ignoring them?
The people I spoke to, they weren't. They didn't talk much about, national electoral politics. It was very, real for them that they were going through. I mean, I'm sure they would be willing to, but that it wasn't, a priority on their mind. They just wanted to get out of this nightmare. But I will say, if you saw, there was an interview with that reporter, Savannah Hernandez, on Laura Ingraham last night, and she explained that they did end up putting their cameras away. Everyone put their cameras away, and even after they put their cameras away, she wouldn't answer questions. So it's insulting to this community, and I guess they know that they're not going to get their vote either way. So you don't have to respect them.
Yeah, it just looks terrible, especially considering what Buttigieg has been doing with supply chains, flight cancellations. It's like all these airlines are just overbooking flights, then canceling people left and right. And Buttigieg is going out and saying, you do potentially have the right to go wait in line at the counter and get refunds. And I'm not fining the airlines. Like, he wouldn't go along with Bernie Sanders' proposal to brutally fine the airlines if they continue to abuse the American consumer. And then it rolls right into this. And he waits until Trump gets there. I mean, it just seems so politically boneheaded. Then he tries to wear a hard hat and winds up still looking like the McKinsey consultant who's going to lay everyone off. I mean, and There was an interview, however, with the mayor of East Palestine, Trent Conaway, where he specifically addresses the issue of Ukraine.
I think he has to prove himself to you. And Mayor, before we let you go, you saw President Joe Biden over in Ukraine. Did that make you feel slighted in any way? I mean, he hasn't really. Can you not hear me?
I got you,
Well,
Trent. He asked it, before we go. I can repeat. He said,
I
with the
think need a
president being in
translator.
Ukraine today, did that surprise you?
Absolutely. That was the biggest slap in the face. That tells you right now he doesn't care about us. So
agreed.
He can send every agency he wants to, but I found that out this morning in one of the briefings that he was in the Ukraine giving millions of dollars away to people over there, not to us. And I'm furious.
On President's Day in our country.
Yeah, President's Day in our country. He's over in Ukraine. So that tells you what kind of guy he is.
Well, that really seems to me how Americans feel. That was the feeling at our rally in Washington. That sense that, America comes after Ukraine. I joked on Twitter that the DNC is moving Ukraine ahead of Ohio in the presidential primary cycle for 2024, because it's obviously more important to Biden. It's certainly, Ukraine has delivered a lot more for the Biden family than Ohio. But the funny thing is that Biden campaign was brought on as Barack Obama's vice president to win over those Rust Belt whites, because he supposedly comes from Scranton, PA. He comes from the Rust Belt. He talks their language. He wears a Union jacket. He's, a straight talking guy. And then the first thing he does is he goes to like the World Economic Forum BlackRock pet project in Kiev after this disaster. And, I think they didn't even take it seriously until probably a week afterwards.
Yeah, it was a good 10, 11 days until that mushroom cloud photo, which was obviously taken the day that happened. Right before that was plastered all over social media. So maybe they were looking at it and they're like, no one's really talking about it, it's fine. And then within days, for some reason, on social media, people really started paying attention to what's going on, and they made them look dumb because they hadn't been there yet, and we all saw the mushroom cloud. And we were starting to hear stories about burning lungs, dead pets, and, no one's there from the federal government.
Well, we're going to bring in Aaron Mate next. I don't know where the buzzsaw is. I don't see him in the back end, but I guess we can keep this going till I see a sign of Aaron Mate. But we're talking to Jeremy Lafredo about what's been taking place in the Ohio Oblast of the United States.
There's another, if we want to just talk about this for a second. The company that's also helping Norfolk Southern and the EPA do air and soil testing is something called Tetra Tech. And Tetra Tech, they have the same main shareholders as Norfolk Southern, BlackRock and Vanguard. And Tetra Tech is being sued right now by the Department of Justice for providing entirely fraudulent soil samples to the EPA to protect their client, which was the U.S. Navy. And it's being called, quote, the biggest case of eco-fraud in U.S. history. So you have these two private companies that have a really controversial past helping out Norfolk Southern and the EPA, telling everything it's fine. So that's just another one of the horrible private companies.
And it's just so funny. Norfolk Southern is owned by BlackRock, and so is Tetra Tech.
Yep, exactly. So
we're going to sell our publishing rights at the Grayzone to BlackRock after this stream. While we wait on Aaron, what was it like getting around the town? Was it difficult?
The town is extraordinarily small. There's a main street that runs along the railroad track, which cuts the town in half essentially. But it's not more than a mile and a half by a mile and a half. It takes 5 minutes to get from one end of the town to the other. It was funny. There's a McDonald's in town, and it's the only place with free Wi-Fi. So the McDonald's was just filled with journalists. It was just journalists who, they bought a order of fries because they wanted to use the free Wi-Fi. But that's really one of the few places to get food in the town. It's really a small village. You have to go out of town to go to the grocery store. You have to go out of town to do a bunch of things. So it's this tiny town up against this giant $55 billion corporation that has its own private police or military, however you want to put it, and their own entirely corrupt, their environmental testing companies. They really don't. They feel like they don't stand a chance, which is it looks like they don't by the looks how the federal government is handling this.
Well, and we've seen this in so many inner cities where there's been dumping sites or power companies placed in the middle of neighborhoods where people basically had no say. They had and the representatives were completely paid off. I mean, I see it down here in Southeast in Washington, D.C., where basically the developers control the mayor, and the developers are building luxury housing and displacing tons of people here. And actually, when I've seen neighbors try to fight against luxury condos being built in the middle of their street without parking, and then the parking all be zoned, and then everyone's going to lose their ability to park or get tons of tickets, and then they won't be able to pay their tickets, and then they'll have to go into debt or be moved out. You realize that the developers have actually been literally paying the Board of Zoning and Development. So the whole local government in Washington, D.C., and you see it in cities across America, completely bought off. It looks like the local government in East Palestine just doesn't even have a chance when you have private police coming in a town of 4,000. And I mean, what did they get? $25,000 total, $1,000 for each resident.
If you were in the 1 mile evacuation zone, they gave you a $1,000 evacuation inconvenience fee is what they called it. And then when you went to go get that $1,000 inconvenience fee, they asked for your social security card because that's going to be taxed. So these people, they got maybe $700, and the way that they evacuated was very it didn't line up with logic. You would have people who were closer to the railroads not get evacuated, and people who were their next door neighbor across the street, they got evacuated. And you only were able to get that $700 if you were evacuated. So it's not very convenient for the people there.
I mean, is there going to be was anyone talking about any legal action?
There are, how would I put it, kind of shark-like lawyers were, in the town when I came, from Texas. They weren't even from Ohio. And there was this weird thing where everyone was told to go to the high school, and everyone was told to go to the cafeteria in the high school for a pasta dinner. And no one knew who actually was organizing it. No one really knew how they found out about it. Their friend just told them to come. And before you knew it, you had a cafeteria filled with people who live in East Palestine. The lights dim, and it's a lawyer from Texas trying to get them all to go in on a lawsuit. So who knows if it was legitimate or not, but some of them definitely felt like they were about to be, given a sales pitch of some sort, and be taken advantage of once again, only weeks after the original disaster. So I'm sure there's going to be some types of litigation and lawsuits against the company, but the people in the town are dealing with these out-of-state lawyers, and everyone's trying to make a buck off them, and there's really nowhere to turn.
Well, it really does. Really does signal to me how people have just been completely left on their own in this country, while we're told to do everything we can to show solidarity with Ukraine and the two countries we live in. And what the Biden administration has done is they've completely teed up the message of Donald Trump's 2024 campaign. Aaron, raise your hand if you're ready to come in. So yeah, here he is, the Aaron Mate. I always pronounce your name like it's the Argentinian tea, Aaron Mate. But they've completely teed up the message for Donald Trump's America First 2024 campaign by the contrast that Biden has shown in his concern for Zelensky and the Maidan regime that rewarded his family and his son with an $80,000 a month paycheck for sitting on the board of Burisma, where he basically was the steward of this regime from 2015 to the end of the Obama administration. And now he's back. So Trump is going to win Ohio if he gets through the primary, and he's going to do it with this message that the U.S. should end the Ukraine proxy war and begin to focus on the wars inside its own borders. And that's why I think, Aaron, you look at the Republican primary and you see Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo, hardcore neocons who are going to do, and Ron DeSantis, honestly, kind of a safe bet for the national security state, someone who's going to do performative culture war antics, but he's going to do what they want. They're setting them up to try to stop Trump from demonstrating this contrast between Ohio and Ukraine. And I think that's what 2024 is going to be all about.
I think Ron DeSantis is going to pretend that he's sort of in Trump's camp when it comes to proxy wars. But I think ideologically, if I were to, I don't know much about him, but if I were just to guess what he said, based on what he said before, I do think he's more of a neocon. But I think he's there to kind of maybe divert votes away from Trump by maybe catering to some of the anti-neocon rhetoric that Trump has put out there. And speaking of which, and we have the clip, I think we should play it. Trump dropped this video this week.
Yeah.
Of his statement about Ukraine, where he called out what he called neocons and warmongers. He named names like Victoria Nuland, and he's reviving the message of his 2016 campaign, which is portraying himself as being for peace and anti-war. And we could talk about, of course, the part that he left out of his rant, which is that he appointed a bunch of neocons who pursued a radical escalation of tension with Russia and played a major role in giving us the Ukraine war. Without Trump's policies, I don't think the Ukraine war, or at least I think Trump's policies made the Ukraine war a lot more likely, I should say. But at the same time, he did drop now a lot of truth bombs, and I do think he will revive that to try to win over the vote in the Republican base, just like he did successfully in 2016, because the fact is there are a lot of people who are tired of all these proxy wars, and especially tired of the Ukraine war. So,
well, before we play this, Jeremy, any final words, any closing thoughts before you have to go?
I just want to point out that East Palestine's municipal budget for the year is $8 million. Okay, so we could, drastically improve the facilities and lives of people living in this town and their ability to, overcome this catastrophe just by giving them, another $10 million. We would double their budget, which is something that they've never even experienced before. And instead, the federal government is giving hundreds of millions to Ukraine. So it really, sets the contrast there, and how easy it would be to help them, and how little they are willing to do that.
Well, thanks so much for informing us, Jeremy. And we're looking forward to your video report from East Palestine, Ohio, which will be featured here at the Grayzone in the coming days.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for joining us. Take care. So Trump delivered this rant, which I think sets the tone for the 2024 campaign. And Ukraine is going to be a huge issue.
World War III has never been closer than it is right now. We need to clean house of all of the warmongers and America last globalists and the deep state, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the national security industrial complex. One of the reasons I was the only president in generations who didn't start a war is that I was the only president who rejected the catastrophic advice of many of Washington's generals, bureaucrats, and the so-called diplomats who only know how to get us into conflict, but they don't know how to get us out. For decades, we've had the very same people, such as Victoria Nuland and many others just like her, obsessed with pushing Ukraine toward NATO, not to mention the State Department support for uprisings in Ukraine. These people have been seeking confrontation for a long time, much like the case in Iraq and other parts of the world. And now we're teetering on the brink of World War III. And a lot of people don't see it, but I see it. And I've been right about a lot of things. They all say Trump's been right about everything. None of this excuses in any way the outrageous and horrible invasion of Ukraine 1 year ago, which would have never happened if I was your president, not even a little chance. But it does mean that here in America, we need to get rid of the corrupt globalist establishment that has botched every major foreign policy decision for decades. And that includes President Biden, whose own people said he's never made a good decision when it comes to looking at other countries and looking at wars. We have to replace them with people who support American interests. Over our 4 years in the White House, we made incredible progress.
So, yeah, I mean, there's 2 more minutes. Trump did seem to allude to the Maidan coup back in 2014, which Victoria Nuland presided over, which is pretty fascinating. And it sounded like a fairly strongly non-interventionist message.
Yeah, it is. If you take it just
at face
on
value.
its own. But the problem is he ignores his own policies and his own role in fueling all the warmongering that he is now claiming to oppose. I'm not saying what he's saying is wrong, because what he's saying is correct, but it's just he's leaving out his own role. He appointed people like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and he oversaw policies like sending weapons to Ukraine that Obama would not send. He tore up the INF treaty with Russia, which basically was a major escalation of the Cold War, because that treaty had eliminated an entire class of weapons, and the treaty that allowed the U.S. to continue testing them, which is what the U.S. immediately did under Trump. Trump also threatened New START, which was about to expire until Biden renewed it. He tried to stop the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline with sanctions. So he appointed all these neocons that he's now claiming to be against. And it's great to hear him say this, but I just don't think it, the problem is he has no record to point to that can actually demonstrate that he's been willing to back up his rhetoric with action. But this does point to why people in the establishment hate Trump. And Christian Parenti had a great article about this recently in the Grayzone, where sometimes Trump speaks the truth. And that's inconvenient for the national security state to have a leader who sometimes is honest about who they are. And yeah, when he mentioned the State Department supporting uprisings in Ukraine, if he's talking about 2014, that's the highest level U.S. official to ever acknowledge that the U.S. was behind that coup. So that is pretty significant.
Other than Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Piat in a leaked phone call where they're just straight up saying,
yeah, that's true,
what they're doing.
Yeah.
The fear of Trump is more what he'll say than what he'll do, because as an executive, you're actually kind of limited. You're supposed to be a figurehead, especially when it comes to foreign policy, that your policies are supposed to be decided by a permanent bureaucracy.
Right.
In the diplomatic corps, as well as a kitchen cabinet of neocons and liberal interventionists with fake expertise like Robert Kagan, Victoria Nuland's husband, who was advising Hillary Clinton in 2016 and who has his acolytes infesting the Biden administration, as well as Jake Sullivan, who was one of the intellectual authors of the Nord Stream pipeline bombing, according to Seymour Hersh and according to everything we know. And so Donald Trump is at least resistant to that. So figures like Bolton and Pompeo were there to kind of manage him. It seems clear that at the very least, he'll be harder to manage in 2024 if he somehow makes it into the White House, which I doubt will be allowed to happen. Who Trump will surround himself with, how he'll actually manage foreign policy without the usual suspects, to me seems elusive. But let's talk about Biden's trip to Ukraine really quickly. I mean, this was, to me, a desperate PR stunt. And I'd like to know what you think is behind Biden's decision. Here he is with Zelensky and basically a siren. Incoming. They're bombing Kiev with pallets of cash stolen from U.S. taxpayers, apparently. They're surrounded with camera people. The whole area of the city sealed off. There's no one there.
I mean, this is so funny. Right when Biden and Zelensky pop out of that building, church, whatever it is, an air siren goes off as if they're under some kind of threat. And unfortunately, though, their photo op was blown up by none other than CNN, which pointed out the inconvenient fact that Kiev hasn't even had air sirens go off at all in the last recent days until the very moment when Biden and Zelensky walked out.
I've been here for the past 5 days. I have not heard any explosions. I have not heard any air sirens until about half an hour ago, right when President Biden was in the center of Kiev, as Clarissa was just mentioning. I've been here for the past 5 days. I have not heard.
So how cynical is that? How cynical is that? You're in a war zone. This country is being invaded, and you go there and you use your visit to pretend as if you're in some kind of threat. Like you're sort of making fun of Ukrainians who actually are living in fear of being bombed by using the air siren as a photo op. And of course, to making it all the more ridiculous, this idea that Biden and Zelensky are being daring and, you know, using an air siren to dramatize the situation is the fact, which got acknowledged somewhere in U.S. media, but not nearly enough, that the U.S. told Russia ahead of time that Biden was visiting. So there are all these stories about a cloak and dagger covert Biden mission, and all these cable news pundits like falling over themselves to praise him for daring to go into a combat zone. And we have some of those clips, we can play them.
Well, let's look at the propaganda first, how this was sold. We got the BBC. This whole report is basically, it might as well have been written by the White House. Biden in Ukraine, how the president's surprise visit was kept a secret. And, you know, despite widespread speculation among the press corps that Mr. Biden might be planning a trip to Ukraine while he's in Poland, the visit still took everyone completely by surprise, right? The sight of him appearing beside Vladimir Zelensky in the heart of Kiev and under the sound of air raid sirens makes a louder statement than anything he can say in a speech in Poland. That's the BBC's own writing. It reads like his own press secretary wrote, well, hey, here is someone who works for his press secretary, White House Communications Director Kate Bedingfield. It was risky and should leave no doubt in anyone's mind that Joe Biden is a leader who takes commitment seriously. But in reality, I mean, the U.S. told Russia, and what was Russia going to do? Were they actually going to shoot Biden down? No.
Well, that's the other funny thing is Biden didn't even fly right into Ukraine. He flew first to Germany. Okay, stopped in Germany. Then they flew over to Poland. And then they took a car from the Polish airport to the border. And then at the border, they took a train. So this idea of this like daring flight into the war zone, which some people like Claire McCaskill spread, that Biden like flew in, you know, covertly, like trying to evade the Russians into the war zone. It's just, it's a complete fantasy. And what happened was,
Hillary spread a similar lie about entering. I think it was Bosnia.
Yeah,
when she flew. That they had to do this spiraling emergency landing to the onto the tarmac. It was just completely made up. But this is even more gross deception. Here's a AP correspondent on how Biden actually pulled off his secret visit.
It's not unusual for presidents to visit war zones, certainly where Americans are combatants. But the critical difference between those trips and going to Kiev is that the U.S. isn't a belligerent in Kiev, in Ukraine. It doesn't control the airspace. It doesn't have a very large troop presence. President Biden spent about 23 hours on the ground on Ukrainian soil. That included about 5 hours in Kiev and time on the train there and back. So the logistics of pulling something like this off safely were incredibly complex. Part of what allowed the president to do this is the notification to Russia, so that they wouldn't want to trigger any sort of miscalculation that can start off essentially nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia, the two nuclear armed powers. But also U.S. surveillance planes flying along the Polish border.
So they notified Russia. Steely-eyed Biden.
You know, by the way, a funny point here for haters of Seymour Hersh. These OSINT people, see if they can find Biden's plane flying into Germany. See if they can find a record of that. They can't, because the transmitters were turned off. And so all these OSINT people, when they try to, like, you know, dismiss Hersh's reporting, and they say, oh, look, we can't find that surveillance, like flight that set off the sonic boom that set off the bombs. We can't find that in our OSINT maps. That means there was no flight. That means the Hersh is wrong. Well, try to find the flight of Biden flying into Germany. It's not there, because they turned off the transmitter. Because a newsflash for Bellingcat and other OSINT people, intelligence people think of this kind of stuff, and they don't want their activities to be able to be picked up in open source. So that's why they hide it. And a similar thing happened, I think, with the bombing of the Nord Stream 2. It's just something that they overlooked, among many other things.
Yeah. Well, they'll do better following Elon Musk's jet, I guess.
Yeah. But in terms of why Biden went to Kiev, I think, you know, obviously a main reason is just for U.S. domestic consumption and for all of his media stenographers to praise him as this daring hero who went into a combat zone to shore up support for the proxy war at home 1 year into the war, with no appetite at all in Washington for any kind of diplomacy. They want to keep it going. And also because I think Zelensky probably needs the support too, because inside the Ukrainian government, we're talking about one of the most corrupt governments in the world. There's all kinds of infighting. There are people fighting over the loot, like fighting over the bounty that they're getting from the international community, especially the US. And Zelensky might be facing some challenges from within on that. And Biden going to meet him personally, I think, is a show of support. Like it's an endorsement that, like, you know, him putting his arm around Zelensky is a sign that the Godfather still backs this capo inside Kiev. So I think that's also what this was about.
Yeah, he's a capo in more ways than one. I mean, being a Jew at the top of a regime that backs literal Nazis makes him a different kind of capo.
That's true.
Well, Biden's visit also was accompanied by a desperate attempt to sell Americans on his bravery and on the importance of doing this while the country was suffering. Here's this is Douglas Brinkley on Biden's Kiev photo op.
Our resident historian,
a resident court historian.
Like either the presidential visit,
like always this guy or Michael Betchloss.
Oh yeah,
the blow dried hair historians. Like real historians look they're kind of crazy and like, you know, they're chain smokers and they're wearing like tattered tweed jackets. These guys, they always have crisp suits and their hair is perfectly blow dried. They look like wax museum sculptures.
It's to war zones. Presidents have visited Iraq and Afghanistan in recent years, but those were U.S. wars. This is a Ukrainian war.
By the way, that's Jim Sciutto, not to be confused with prosciutto. And he is a former State Department employee. He actually dropped his job at CNN to go work in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing under Obama and was the assistant chief of staff. He was the chief of staff to Gary Locke, who was the U.S. ambassador there. That's a pretty strategically significant embassy. So you basically have a guy who's repping for the State Department in the CNN anchor chair. In case it wasn't obvious.
That should be in his chyron when CNN identifies him. It should say former State Department propagandist. But you know what's also funny about Jim Sciutto is when Russia invaded, he gave this like dramatic monologue from Ukraine, because remember, like back then, every Western correspondent flooded to Ukraine, and he was among them. And he gave this dramatic monologue where he said, before Russia invaded, Ukraine was at peace. It wasn't at war with anyone. There's nothing going on. It's like, did you not know that there's been a civil war going on there for 8 years that like the U.S. was majorly involved in as well? And that was a major reason why Russia invaded, because actually Ukraine was escalating its assaults on eastern Ukraine, where ethnic Russians are, and was threatening to basically wipe it out. Like, did you not know that? Or are you just forgetting it? I don't know what these people, whether they're lying or they just don't even know the basic facts of the issues they're reporting on.
I mean, he's one of the most aggressive propagandists. He gets unfettered access to the national security state. John Brennan, by the way, former CIA director, is he's an MSNBC contributor, right?
Yeah.
He's referred to merely as a national security contributor. They never note that he speaks for Langley when he appears on MSNBC. Here's let's continue.
No U.S. military presence on the ground. How
hagiography.
It's extremely significant. The United States is wedded more to the Ukraine than ever before. I go back to history and think of Roosevelt and Churchill when FDR had to sneak off in the dead of night, even had a body double at one point to first meet Winston Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland. And then, of course, you had all those World War II meetings between Churchill. It's worth.
Also had to sneak off to meet his mistress.
I mean, mentioning Churchill, because Zelensky has been called the Churchill of our generation, and Biden going there today, I think it's going to be a moment for the history books. It's like when John F. Kennedy
he's a Churchill in that he uses poison gas on his enemies.
Went to Berlin in 1961 and gave a speech at the height of the Cold War. Ukraine is the new Berlin. It's the rally point for NATO and the Western allies. And I think Biden did something really heroic.
Well, there you have it. It was heroic. No, I don't know what normal people agree with that, but we could go through so many clips of media praise, mainly on CNN. Here is
it's just a spectacle. It
just goes on and on. Here's this is Claire McCaskill, who's the former right-wing Democratic governor of Missouri, and she's like, you know, the voice of the she's the true voice of the MSNBC now, the right wing of the Democratic Party.
This one's really funny.
Wallace, former George W. Bush flack. They always have like the true embodiment of the establishment when they bring 4 people on MSNBC.
I'm not sure that it was all pre-planned, but it has certainly all been well executed. His back and forth with the nuttiest of the nutty Republicans at the State of the Union, pulling off this trip and these images of defenders of democracy.
She always sounds kind of drunk.
From 2 very different generations, walking shoulder to shoulder in Kiev. What do you make of this presidency?
Well, it's very important because in the back of everyone's mind, there's always a contrast. There's always a comparison. And this kind of dovetails with what you talked about earlier, that when the president runs for re-election, it is not a referendum on him. It is a choice. And if you compare and contrast Donald Trump was afraid to go to Afghanistan. And Afghanistan.
Donald Trump was afraid to stay upstairs during the Black Lives Matter protests.
Exactly. I mean, very little courage. And, you know, having flown into war zones a number of times, both Iraq and Afghanistan, as a member of the Senate, was there moments that it was weird? Yes, but there was always a sense that you're surrounded by the United States military. You're enveloped by the United States military. When that Air Force...
Kind of like the people of Afghanistan or the people in Ukraine. They're enveloped by the U.S. military. Isn't that reassuring?
One flew over the border into Ukraine. Everybody knows it was just that airplane.
Sorry, I said she was governor. She was senator.
From the United States in that airspace. And that took courage. And that courage is a very important.
Yeah,
that's a lie. She doesn't realize this, but the plane did not fly into Ukraine.
Yeah,
it flew into Germany. Then he flew again to Poland, and then from there Poland took a car to the Polish border with Ukraine, and then took a train. So she's making up this idea that he flew in on this risky flight into this Ukraine war zone.
It's completely made up. I just want to point out something else here, which is interesting about MSNBC. You see the 4 people you have. This is like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You have the Democratic Party centrist hack. Then you have the media guy to her left. I think that's like John Heilman, who's complete centrist regime lackey. Then you have the spook, who represents the deep state. I think that's Jeremy Bash, who is the former spokesperson for the CIA and the Pentagon.
You know, Max, I don't think that's Jeremy Bash.
That's not Jeremy Bash?
I don't think that is, no. I don't.
Kind of looks like him.
It looks like him. I think that guy just might be a correspondent.
Okay, that's just the guy. Yeah, that's a correspondent. All right, my bad. Well, they often have the spook, and then they have Nicole Wallace, who's, you know, the Bush Republican.
Yeah.
So this is really the regime right there.
Yeah.
And that regime includes Pompeo and Nikki Haley. So that's what they're lining up against Trump.
Yeah.
Anyway, remarkable stuff. I mean, they just are straight up lying about Biden's trip. The air raid siren was fake. The surprise was fake. The landing in Kiev was fake. The whole thing was a gigantic stunt. And, you know, if he had just taken a car to East Palestine, Ohio, I think he'd be slightly more well-liked by Americans, but that's not who he's catering to. It's like the European leaders who are willing to cut off energy to their own people, to the poor and working people of Europe in order to satisfy NATO. They're not representing any constituents.
There's some weird way in which these cable news hosts are so giddy and so enthused about saying Kiev the way Western Ukrainians
take that, Putin. I'll order a chicken Kiev.
Yeah. Everyone does it now. It's like it's like a fad. It's taken over everybody. I'm still a holdout because I always thought it was Kiev. So why should I change it? Just because it fits in with a proxy war propaganda. But it's like a trend, and if you don't say it, you're you're on the outs. Like you're an outsider. Like you're not allowed on cable news if you pronounce Kiev.
Well, we saw the cancel culture in the Australian Open against Russia and Belarus, where Russian and Belarusian competitors had to actually compete without their flag appearing. They had to have basically a white flag of surrender appearing by their name. The female champion of the Australian Open wasn't even allowed to hold up her own country's flag. She was from Belarus. And, right here in Washington, Russian identity is being erased. There's always been a Russian diaspora here, and you talk to them, and not all of them support Putin. Many of them are anti-Putin, but this city is turned completely anti-Russian. There's a Russian restaurant here near DuPont Circle called Marivana, and they now on their menu, it says, enjoy the Ukrainian classic of borscht, because they have to erase Russia on their own menu.
Yeah.
And I spoke to several Russian people who are in the diaspora here in Washington who tell me that they've shown me exchanges on their Facebook pages where Ukrainians are just coming in, local Ukrainians, and telling them that they hope they get hit by HIMARS. They hope they all die. The Russia House, which is another Russian restaurant that sort of was apolitical, completely apolitical, and it used to have a Russian flag in front of it. At the beginning of the Russiagate saga, it was repeatedly vandalized. Vandalized when there were these anti-Trump resistance marches, and just randomly vandalized. Now it looks to be completely closed. And there was a ABC News report about the Ukrainian efforts to purge their libraries of all Russian literature, Tolstoy, to purge any mention of Dostoevsky, Soviet history books. This is a pretty shocking clip.
Hi, I'm Patrick Reevell with ABC News, and we're here in Kiev. We're at a paper recycling plant here. The reason we're here is that we're watching hundreds of Russian books about to be pulped. You can see these men are chucking them into this chute, and then they will go up there and be pulped. There's really all types of books here. We've just seen him throw several volumes of Tolstoy, as well as this books here about the Soviet victory in World War II. There's books about Soviet tanks. Basically, this is part of an initiative by a bookshop in the center of Kiev, where people can voluntarily bring Russian books they no longer want in their homes to be recycled, and say that they're not simply destroying books, that they will be recycled and turned into something, in their words, more useful. But obviously, this is a pretty powerful symbol of Ukraine's rejection of Russian culture.
Let's hear that again.
In their words, more useful. But obviously, this is a pretty powerful symbol of Ukraine's rejection of Russian culture.
Yeah, like the powerful symbols of Germans' rejection of Jewish culture when they burned books that contained Jewish or Bolshevik influence. And that's exactly what's going on there. I don't know how anyone with any level of education that correspondent had could potentially smile on or praise a de facto book burning with cultural treasures. I mean, the work of Tolstoy, disgusting. And he was summoned there because they're so proud of what they're doing in destroying books and destroying literature, that they wanted a U.S. correspondent to broadcast this to the entire American public. And he calls it a pretty powerful symbol. That shows just how much our own culture has degenerated, that we would celebrate book burning and the destruction of literature. Of course, you start burning books, that is the precursor to burning people. And we see that happening. You're muted, Aaron.
Think about how much bigotry this proxy war has exposed about NATO states. So you have this like unhinged Russophobia that's been going on for a long time, especially during Russiagate. It really peaked. But then also think about, remember all those clips of those Western war correspondents early on in the war talking about how things like, like doing their live shots from Ukraine and saying things like, well, we expect this from the brown countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. But this is a civilized country of Europe, and these are people who look like us. There's all those clips like that. And then, of course, the most glaring example of bigotry is how tolerant all these people are of arming a neo-Nazi infused military and going from describing groups like Azov Battalion as being neo-Nazi to now calling them, like the New York Times does, celebrated. Whereas before, 8 years ago, they could accurately call Azov neo-Nazi. So all this shows an extreme hatred of Russia and Russian culture, an extreme contempt for global South countries that are the usual targets of wars that we wage, and just decrying the fact that now some white Europeans are the targets of a war, and the extreme tolerance of neo-Nazis if they're on the right side of the gun barrel, because we're arming Azov Battalion. So, I mean, it exposes just like how bigotry and racism is deeply embedded in NATO hegemony, and no one questions it.
Yeah. We have a bad echo there, but that about sums it up. And how tolerant the U.S. is willing to be of Nazis. Jimmy Dore had a great joke, by the way, at the Rage Against the Machine rally, about how the U.S. is sending so much money to Nazis in Ukraine that Nazis in the U.S. can barely afford to buy eggs. and of course the most humorless people in America at the World Socialist website quoted it and said, Jimmy Dore bizarrely wondered why the U.S. was not giving more money to Nazis at home.
Oh, come on. Oh, God, that's hilarious.
The ADL, as we reported, has cleared the Azov Battalion of all charges of bigotry. So I guess it's okay. I think this is really relevant to the conversation we've been having. Matt Gaetz has introduced a Ukraine Fatigue Act, and the country is becoming fatigued about the war. Support for the Ukraine proxy war, for sending all this money to Ukrainian warlords. The numbers are going down among Democrats. A new poll in Italy by a mainstream Italian paper, maybe I'll put up the poll later, shows that a vast majority of Italians would like to end the war immediately and require Ukraine to cede territory to Russia that it has lost in order to save lives and end the war. Italians are suffering economically far worse than Americans are. I was there in early November, and the public heat was being delayed for several weeks because of energy shortages. So those numbers make sense. So Samantha Power has gone to Fareed Zakaria, a real hard-hitting interviewer who's definitely going to ask some extremely critical questions, to have a town hall. I think it was alongside Jake Sullivan, in order to explain the importance of the war to Americans. And it wasn't exactly like they were allowing the town into this hall, because if that had happened, the results would have been different. Let's hear from Samantha Power, who is basically the queen of humanitarian R2P liberal interventionism.
What is at stake in Ukraine are values and interests so core to the United States.
Values. They always talk about
Imagine
values.
just wanting your freedom and your independence. I mean, this country is predicated on exactly those two values. Imagine the counterfactual, where we walk away or we didn't show up in the first place, and what that would mean when...
If we didn't show up in the first place, this never would have happened. Everything she's saying is so suffused with deception.
And a dictator who has shut down civil society, shut down independent media, shut down dissenting voices in his own country.
Is she talking about Zelensky? Because there's no independent media in Ukraine.
Then
Or is she talking about imprisoning Julian Assange?
And with impunity, take over that country. I mean, what would that mean?
No one's trying to take over Ukraine.
For our allies in Europe, what would that mean for our own security over time? So I think, Americans understand bullies and the importance of standing up to bullies. At the same time, again, we're very alert to the risks, given that Russia is a nuclear armed power, as you rightly say. But that is, again, how we are in the position that we are in now, building a coalition of countries coming together, making sure that this isn't just the United States and Russia, that this, in fact, is Ukrainians on the front lines, Ukrainians doing the fighting, and a coalition of 50 countries rallying behind them, and including actually today, more than 140 countries at the UN signaling still a year into the war their support for Ukraine's self-defense.
There's a lot to chew on there. I'm surprised how inarticulate she is, considering her background in media and how she's been propped up as such a genius. And I wonder, is she as daft as she seems, or is she selling the American public on a bunch of lies? Because virtually everything she said was false or contained some element of misinformation. I mean,
she's a seasoned scam artist. She's been pushing lies to justify U.S. aggression in country after country, in Syria and Libya, and she's applying that to here. And she has this kind of her and Maddow have a similar shtick where they'll pretend to be sort of like, they have this kind of earnest shtick. Well, they pretend to just be like they don't understand why our enemies can't possibly understand how generous we are and how well intentioned we are. And imagine if we weren't there doing all these wonderful things, what a terrible world it is. So she poses as a humanitarian to spread aggression and death. I mean, that's her job. And she's one of the most disingenuous people, I think, in political life today. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, you're doing a town hall with Fareed Zakaria. Zakaria, it demonstrates how the colonial subject can propel his ambitions within an imperial society, and that is to be the ultimate stooge of those in power. He never, ever, he goes to Davos and will never ask a tough question. He'll never ask a tough question there in that interview setting. And all of his critical questions are always framed in a way that gives his guest an out. I've never seen any of these people subjected to the kind of tough interviews that, for example, George W. Bush subjected himself to when he went on Meet the Press with Tim Russert. Obviously, he was losing popularity. Americans were dying in the war. But, Biden has never sat down for a tough interview. Vladimir Zelensky, have you ever seen a sit-down interview with him where he actually has to answer tough questions? No. So this is complete theater, and it's actually dramatically different from the last CNN town hall that I remember about a war by a Democratic administration, featuring Madeleine Albright, who was kind of a mentor to Samantha Power and the liberal interventionists.
Yeah.
And Albright, by the way, was herself mentored by Zbigniew Brzezinski at Georgetown University. Both are children of Europe who come from anti-communist families who saw land taken by communists, who came to the United States to try to engineer regime change wars to get revenge on the Soviet Union. So this is an amazing, and I think this should inspire those of you out there who want to get offline and do some activism against this war. This is from a town hall on Iraq. I think it was 1999, after the Iraq Liberation Act was passed, setting the stage by the Clinton administration for the regime change war in Iraq. And it's Sandy Berger and Madeleine Albright. And the town hall actually featured members of the town. It wasn't controlled the way the one with Jake Sullivan and Samantha Power was.
The microphone is off. There we are. What do you have to say about dictators of countries like Indonesia, who we sell weapons to, yet they are slaughtering people in East Timor? What do you have to say about Israel, who is slaughtering Palestinians, who impose martial law? What do you have to say about that? Those are our allies. Why do we sell weapons to these countries? Why do we support them? Why do we bomb Iraq when it commits similar problems?
Yeah, this is a question that goes to the heart of the values that Samantha Power espouses. Everybody knows there's no values
there. There are
there.
various examples of things that are not right in this world, and the United States is trying.
Look how big it is in there. It's like a real arena.
that it is necessary to defend the rights of Saddam Hussein, when what we ought to be thinking about is how to make sure that he does not use weapons of mass destruction.
I'd like to.
Who are shouting, just a moment.
I'm not defending him in the least. What I am saying is that there needs to be consistent application of U.S. foreign policy. We cannot support people who are committing the same violations because they are political allies. That is not acceptable. We cannot violate UN resolutions when it is convenient to us. You're not answering my question, Madam Albright.
So that was what a real town hall would look like if one were allowed. And Aaron, any reaction?
Well, I think they've learned their lesson from the Albright experience, because there hasn't been anything that I can remember like that since. That was an amazing episode. That was broadcast live on CNN. I remember it well. And I mean, something like that since hasn't happened. The closest we've gotten to the truth from our U.S. officials is when they accidentally blurted out. Like, remember when Joe Biden was speaking at Harvard College in 2015 or 2014, and he accidentally admitted that there was no moderate rebels in Syria, and that the U.S. allies were supporting an insurgency dominated by, he said, Al Qaeda and ISIS.
Sponsored by Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Turkey. It's like the problem is our allies over there.
Yeah,
because he gets the briefings and he doesn't know that you're not supposed to actually tell the public the truth. So he went on some international apology tour, and he had to call Erdogan, sorry, please keep the ISIS guys going over the border. John Kerry's watching them.
And of course, and there's no journalist to ask these people any of these questions, because no one gets challenged. I mean, look, again, even the progressives in Congress, when they go on their friendly media outlets, nobody questions. The only person I've seen question a progressive member of Congress aggressively when it comes to the Ukraine proxy war was Brianna Joy Gray when she interviewed Ro Khanna. I can't think of any other examples.
Well, here's
unless you did, but you did, of course, in the street. But I mean, when they go on shows, it doesn't happen anymore.
Well, Anna Kasparian gave a hardball interview to Madeleine Albright at the Munich Security Conference. No.
Yeah, right. I think she actually tried to argue, like whenever that whole thing was happening, where they called me a Russian agent and blah blah blah. I think she tried to argue that she did actually give Madeleine Albright an adversarial interview, which was so funny. But anyway, who cares?
Yeah, it's an honor to meet you, and it's such a pleasure. And wow, let's pose for pictures with this great feminist icon who blew up women in Serbia and Iraq. Well, there actually was a confrontation recently by Jose Vega, who's a political activist in the Bronx, or in New York, and Hakeem Jeffries, who's the new Democratic minority leader. And I thought this was significant. This is what journalists should be doing. This is what anti-war activists should be doing. And let's take a look at that.
The UN Security Council had a meeting yesterday, and Ray McGovern spoke to it. He is a former member of the CIA, and he testified in support of Seymour Hersh's article on the United States bombing Nord Stream.
And this is a town hall.
If it is proven that the United States bombed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, as has been asserted by Seymour Hersh and his article, will you call for the United States to acknowledge and admit that that was an act of war against Germany and Russia? And I'm asking this because this may be the only way to prevent the rest of us from being killed in a thermonuclear war. And I don't want to be fried. Don't you think the media should be reporting on whether or not this is true? And don't you think you should be inquiring into whether or not this is true?
Well, thank you for the question. One, I've got no information to suggest that the United States was involved in bombing the Nord.
Of course you don't.
Because he would have, you would have been, you weren't briefed on it.
Sir,
you got your chance to ask a question.
An opportunity to respond.
You weren't given information because he explicitly says you weren't briefed on it. Shouldn't it require?
So here's what I'll say about, I think, President Biden's leadership generally as it relates to the Ukraine and Russia.
We committed an act of war. What are you doing to respond to that? We have to hold Biden accountable. Listen, you're from Brooklyn, right? You know when to call bullshit when you see it. So do I. This is bullshit right now. and I see what's happening right now. That does not silence me. You can hear me right now. I want you to say something about the bombing, because we're all going to die from a nuclear war right now unless you stop it and you at least put and inquire into whether or not it's true. This war in Ukraine is going to leave us all dead. So what are you going to do? Because you need to inquire. I'm a New Yorker too.
Here's what I'll say.
Say it.
We're going to continue to stand with the Ukrainian people.
That's fucking bullshit. Do not do that. You will end us all
in
dead.
this war against Vladimir Putin.
Peace. We need talks.
Because
Why are
it's
you
not
sabotaging
just-
talks?
it's
Do
not
not put
just
your
a
hands on me.
battle
We
between
need
Ukraine
peace talks.
and
I am not
Russia.
going to take this.
It's a
We need.
battle.
Well, that's how you do it. I mean, I think that's how you have to do it at this point, to get your point across, especially if you feel like there's any urgency here as the conflict escalates. I see a lot of people kind of dismissing the idea that this could turn nuclear. But in any case, that was Hakeem Jeffries' response, and it was complete boilerplate. I mean, Hakeem Jeffries is a company man. We've talked about him before. He's a pet project of the Israel lobby and of Wall Street. And that's what we expected him. There was actually a lobbying day in Congress 2 days after the Rage Against the War Machine rally on February 19th. And Jose Vega just hosted a Twitter space with some of the organizers of the rally. Anya Parampil was on the Twitter space, and I was listening. And he said that Hakeem Jeffries' office agreed to meet with them for 20 minutes and basically repeated the boilerplate, then threw them out. But actually, Kevin McCarthy's office welcomed them in. I think one staffer might have said that they were actually at the rally, but they were very friendly with them, took pictures with them, and actually listened to them and heard them out. So we'll see what obviously the Republicans being in control in the House has created put a lot of pressure on the administration to have to explain this war, and the grassroots activity is creating pressure. There haven't been large-scale rallies against the war until February 19th, and I think that is contributing to the pressure, and that's a good thing. It's time to increase the pressure, intensify the pressure as they escalate in Ukraine.
Well, a good gauge of how effective these protests are is how establishment media hacks respond to them.
Yeah.
And we got a very good window into that when Rachel Maddow covered the Rage Against the War Machine rally, where she basically launched into one of the most disingenuous clips I've ever seen. And that's saying a lot coming from Maddow, who's like a unhinged Trump-Russia conspiracy theorist and a warmonger, supports the proxy war with Ukraine, wants to sacrifice more Ukrainian lives just so that Russia loses. And the way she covered the Rage Against the War Machine rally was just, it was disgusting. So
here's coverage from the QAnon leader, Blue Anon leader, Rachel Maddow of Rage Against the War Machine on February 19th.
And I mean, truly random rally on the National Mall.
Truly random. That's why I'm covering it.
A rally in support of Russia, I guess, given all the Russian flags, at least a rally against the U.S. supporting Ukraine in trying to stand up against the Russian invasion of their country. This was a tiny event. It was small. It was a weird assemblage of Americans. There were Proud Boys there. There were some of the white supremacist groups you'd recognize from the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville a few years ago. Also represented prominently the remains of the bizarre Lyndon LaRouche cult. There were a lot of people with Russian flags, also the occasional flag of the former Soviet Union. Also, at least one person who guest hosts for Tucker Carlson on the Fox News channel was there.
Former presidential candidate.
There were anti-vaccine conspiracy theorists, a lot of them. There were cryptocurrency promoters. It was a really weird group. It was a small rally and a weird one. But that's what it looks like. That's the assemblage of short straws and split ends and loose change and loose electrons that's advocating in this country that Russia's in the right in this war and America should be on Putin's side as he keeps invading other countries.
Well, yeah, that was about what you'd expect from Maddow. It does show, first of all, that this rally actually broke through.
Yeah.
It was a real threat. It obviously was attacked by her. It was also attacked by Joy Reid. It was attacked by the professional sectarian left in coalition. I mean, you could call it, I don't know, like World Socialist Website and others. You could call it like the Red Lib Alliance. And it broke through also in local media markets. But Maddow, it's so funny how she keeps saying it's small, it's tiny, it's random, but
It's weird. She says weird like 10 times.
But she says weird because she doesn't have any contact with any people who are not entirely blue-pilled by every lie and psyop and the entire hybrid war operation that MSNBC on behalf of the American oligarchy is waging on the American mind. And she's so threatened that there are at least just a few thousand Americans who have seen through all the psyops, including, all the lies she told about COVID. And she said, if you take the vaccine, then COVID stops with you. She lied and said it prevents infection and transmission. And then she's attacking people at the rally for having been skeptical of that. She attacks people for being involved in crypto. Crypto.com is kind of a mainstream thing.
But it's better, Max, to be paid $35 million by Comcast. That's how you should be earning money, is through, hard American currency paid for by one of the world's biggest corporations to you for hosting a show. She hosts a show 1 hour per week because doing it 5 days a week was too much for her. So she hosts. So that's how you should be making money, is making $35 million. Just go ahead and do that, everybody. Don't try to make money elsewhere.
Well, so on the Russian flag issue, I was there. There was some guy waving one behind me for my speech the whole time, which was just idiotic. But there were like 2 or 3, maybe 4 Russian flags in the entire thing. They were all being held by people from one organization that has already apologized for it. And they were mostly on the outskirts, trying to do as much unintentional PR damage to the rally as possible when there were far more American flags. And then you did have this character, Matthew Heimbach, sorry to cut you off, Aaron, who was a former Nazi or current Nazi. I don't know what he is. Always was a suspect character. And he was walking around waving a Russian imperial flag and a Soviet flag at the same time, 2 things that don't really seem coherent. Providing and he was way on the outskirts of the rally, giving mainstream media the perfect opportunity to try to smear the entire rally. Any rally that contains political dissidents or that is rallying against the status quo is going to attract some people with a few screws loose or people with extreme views. And the idea that they represent the entire rally or the tenor of the rhetoric on stage is absurd. So the tactics Maddow used were just the lowest, most propagandistic, cheap tactics possible. She was not there and she sent a team there. They didn't interview anyone. And it just shows what kind of, why people hate journalists and the media.
I didn't like seeing the Russian flag there because, of course, that's going to be seized on by people like Maddow. But at the same time, people have the right to wave a flag of any state they want. I mean, Russia's a UN member state. People want to show support for Russia. That's fine. I mean, I was harsh on those flag waivers too, because I thought they kind of spoiled the message of the rally. But at the same time, I don't want to deny someone the right to wave a flag. It's, but they have the right to support Russia if they want to. And it's not even necessarily a display of support for all of Russian policies. It's, when you wave a flag, sometimes it's just a way of showing that we're all here on this earth and we should live together. So, but of course, people like Matt are going to focus on that if 1 or 2 people do it. And the way she talks about Tulsi Gabbard, like as she describes her as a guest host on Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
I mean, Tulsi Gabbard used to be a regular guest on Maddow's show, and Maddow once praised her as a shining star. She said, get to know that name because she's going to be really famous in this party. And of course, all that changed when Tulsi Gabbard resigned from the DNC because they were rigging the primary against Bernie Sanders. And then she became not welcome anymore in places like the Rachel Maddow show. And then she says, later on in the clip, she says, I don't mean any disrespect to those Americans who protested. Yes, you do. You're calling them conspiracy theorists. You're calling them dumb. You're doing everything you can to make them look ridiculous. So she's so dishonest and so actually not confident in her own position that she can't even own it. Like if you're going to disrespect people, at least have the minimal awareness to not claim you're not disrespecting them. But she can't do that because she's actually not solid in her position, because she has to resort to McCarthyite smear tactics to do it. And even painting this rally as being in support of Russia, you had speakers there like David Swanson. I heard him condemn the Russian invasion and call for diplomacy, which is what this rally was about. It was about calling for diplomacy and not fueling this proxy war. But she can't process that thought because she only thinks in terms of an American government propagandist who thinks that we have to fuel this proxy war, and therefore diplomacy can't even be entertained. It can't even be acknowledged.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with Russian flags per se. I have a bigger problem with the Ukrainian flag flying over people's homes all over DC, because we're giving them our money to wage this catastrophic war. We're not giving Russia anything. So, I mean, objectively speaking, that's where I stand. It was just really stupid from a PR point of view, when you know exactly what they're going to do. I told Nick Brana before the rally, like, if anything's going to happen to disrupt or destroy this rally, there's going to be some like Nazi showing up with some suspicious background, doing some Fed stuff to try to make it look like everyone at the rally is a Nazi. And
But
so
the thing is,
version.
But the fact that Maddow tries to paint the rally goers as Nazis speaks to, I think, probably the dumbest irony of her little rant, which is that she is actively supporting a military that formally incorporates a neo-Nazi battalion into its ranks, the Azov Battalion. She's done propaganda for the Azov Battalion countless times. And here she is trying to portray people who want peace in Ukraine, who want negotiations, as being on the side of Nazis, when she is out there every single time she appears on her show doing propaganda for neo-Nazis. A neo-Nazi battalion, not just some random people with some whatever ties to a Nazi group who show up at a rally who aren't even a part of it, but an actual Nazi battalion that she wants to arm and fuel to keep this war going.
Yeah, and I hold her partly responsible for creating space for this war to take place with all of the lies and hysteria she drummed up around Russiagate. But let's take a look at what the rally really looked like from my point of view. I think people can judge for themselves. This is what it really looked like.
Coming up for you next, was there anybody here who
make some
might have
noise? You're on the
attended
Make some noise, make some noise. You're live,
They're going to get set up for us right now. Jordan is a liberty lover, a radical advocate, libertarian coming up for you.
Yeah, so it went on and on and on and on. That the crowd wrapped completely around the stage. So I could have kept showing people of that size, groups of people of that size, for another minute. And of course, many of them watched this stream. They watched Jimmy Dore. It really demonstrated our ability, Jimmy's ability, and the ability of everyone who's been doing this work online to bring people out in real life, offline. And I thought it was a display of power by groups of by alternative and independent media outlets that have been denigrated as marginal. The crowd was obviously much larger than Maddow made it out to be. The march was like 7 blocks long when it got to the White House, and it obviously shook things up. And as I pointed out on Twitter, it broke through into local media markets. You saw NBC and Fox News affiliates from like Santa Barbara, California to Dayton, Ohio to Florida, all across the country covering this rally. And they covered it in a pretty objective way and showed pieces, tidbits of David Swanson's speech, and actually a fairly substantial part of Tulsi Gabbard's speech, which was an excellent speech about how Hawaiians were subjected to false alarm about North Korean ballistic missiles incoming in order to test the emergency response. They were essentially terrorized in order to test the response of average citizens. And the point Tulsi Gabbard was making is there are parts of the United States that will be on the front lines of any war as the Biden administration pivots to Asia and starts to ramp up its hostile campaign against China and North Korea. And the rest of the representatives and political elite in, what they call in Alaska, the lower 48, in the 48 states that are contiguous, they don't understand what Hawaiians go through. So Tulsi Gabbard has a unique experience to speak to, also as a veteran. Dennis Kucinich spoke about the need for congressional action on the Nord Stream terror attack carried out by the U.S. and the importance of Seymour Hersh's report. So I thought that was a significant intervention, along with all of the other speeches that we heard. And it was a success for all of the flaws in the rally. The fact that I don't agree with many of the speakers about major issues, it really was a success, and it opened space for, I think, for more. And we'll see what happens on the ground in Ukraine. That's really going to determine the course of action here in the U.S.
And again, if it wasn't a threat to the establishment, then establishment spokespeople like Rachel Maddow would not be devoting this kind of effort to smearing it. So it's a tribute to the organizers and the people who came out, that someone who has the agenda that you were challenging, which is a devastating proxy war, feels so threatened by it that she feels the need to go to such gutter lengths to smear it.
Yeah.
So everyone who took part in this should feel gratified that someone like Rachel Maddow heaped such animus your way, because that's a validation of everything that the rally goers and the organizers were trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and this is happening all over the world. A rally that was completely ignored in U.S. media took place in Munich on almost the same day against the Munich Security Conference. Look at this scene. I mean, this is massive. They had a permit for like 400 people, my understanding, and something like 13,000 people showed up in Munich. There's going to be a major rally at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, and I am going to be appearing by video, unfortunately, along with Anya Parampil at the No to NATO conference tomorrow in the UK, hosted by Chris Williamson and George Galloway, with a lot of other great speakers, Claire Daly, Mick Wallace, members of European Parliament, Low Key, a lot of other great activists. And this is an important event because the Stop the War Coalition has not exactly been on the ball when it comes to stopping this war. It's all across Europe. People are storming the streets and venting their rage against their leadership for going along with this catastrophic war that has put their economies and their standard of living on the precipice. They're lucky to have had a warm winter, but it's not the last winter where they're going to suffer from energy shortages, all to exact a blow and carry out historical grudges against Russia. So it's time that I think all of these rallies get together and issue a joint declaration. All the organizers start to issue joint declarations against NATO. I think we're going to start to see more of that, more coordination across the Atlantic to counter the transatlantic coordination that's brought us to the brink of nuclear war. So, Aaron, interesting, since we've been talking about Congress, what we're seeing again from a Republican who we wouldn't have thought would be taking the lead here. This is Matt Gaetz, who actually was bringing up a lot of anti-war themes in his interventions against Kevin McCarthy during the leadership debate. But now he's taken to Twitter to declare, what are we trying to win in Syria? If Biden has a plan worthy of risking American lives, he should tell it to Congress. I haven't heard of one. And he has called for all troops to be pulled from Syria in a resolution calling on Biden to end the U.S. occupation of 1/3 of Syria, that part of the northeast of the country where the oil wells are, where the wheat fields are, where the U.S. has been stealing oil. What's going on here?
Well, as U.S. officials have openly explained, Dana Stroul, most famously, she's a senior Pentagon official. The U.S. is occupying Syria for leverage. That's her word, leverage. Because if the U.S. can occupy Syria's oil and wheat, as Dana Stroul explained, then that gives the U.S. leverage over shaping Syria's future, namely finding some way to achieve their longtime goal of forcing out Bashar al-Assad and bringing in a Western subservient leader. And so that's why the U.S. is there. And I think also there's just this general vindictiveness in Washington where Syria was able to defeat the U.S.-backed dirty war in the sense that even though Syria was left largely in ruins and seriously hurt, the death squad that the U.S. was backing, led by al-Qaeda, did not take over. So there's bitterness inside the national security state establishment who want to punish Syria because the U.S. was humiliated because they didn't achieve their regime change goal. So that's why the U.S. has hundreds of troops there stealing Syria's fuel and wheat. And it means that after a devastating earthquake, Syrian machinery and vehicles don't have enough fuel to help rescue people and clean up the rubble because the U.S. is stealing their fuel. And when Syria tries to bring in fuel from elsewhere like Iran, the U.S. sanctions those ships or it gets Israel to bomb them directly. So that's why the U.S. is there. And the U.S. media goes along with this lie that we're really there to fight ISIS. But I've written about this. If you look at the Pentagon's own reports about Operation Inherent Resolve, as it's called, the mission in Syria and Iraq, the U.S. is not fighting ISIS at all. And in fact, there's been close to no engagement on the battlefield in the last several years. ISIS never attacks the U.S. because, of course, they've had this tacit coalition, as John Kerry explained when he noted privately that the U.S. sat back and watched as ISIS was encroaching Damascus. Sometimes the U.S. will go and kill an ISIS leader in a raid. That raid is always pretty much happening in Idlib, which is the al-Qaeda safe haven that the U.S. helped create by arming the coalition led by al-Qaeda that took Idlib. But aside from that, the U.S. isn't fighting ISIS. It's there to steal the oil. So this official pretext is we're there to support the Kurds and fight ISIS. There's barely any fighting against ISIS going along by the U.S. It's really there just to, as Trump said, also to take the oil.
Well, Aaron, I know you have to run to cover for Jimmy Dore. You're the hardest working man in the Red Alliance. Get you to quickly respond to one more clip because that perfectly illustrates the danger of where we're going. And it contains a very ghoulish figure. I don't know if this is Pizza the Hut from Spaceballs put on a wig or something, but there's someone on the right. It says Undersecretary Newland, and she's speaking to Aaron David Miller, who was one of the permanent peace processors, who is always talking about peace in order to allow Israel to put more settlements on the ground. So two of the bigger ghouls in the foreign policy establishment are talking here, and Newland made some disturbing comments, typically, if this agrees to load, which it's not doing. Okay, well, it's not loading. Anyway, Victoria Newland here called for striking Crimea.
Yeah. She basically said, because what happened was in January, there was this article in the New York Times, and the headline was something like, here, I'm going to see if I can pull it up. U.S. warms to helping Ukraine target Crimea. So basically, U.S. warms to the idea of a nuclear holocaust. That's pretty much what that is. And so Aaron David Miller asked Newland about this, and she was nodding her head, pretty much, I think, giving away that she was one of the sources for this story. That's what I took from her response. But anyway, the point is, the story is that the U.S. is warming to the idea of giving Ukraine the weapons it wants to hit Crimea, which, of course, is the territory that Russia annexed in 2014. After, of course, it was a part of Russia historically. It was just transferred to Ukraine in the 1950s in this administrative move. And, of course, the majority of Crimeans, according to every single poll commissioned by the U.S. government, want to be a part of Russia. But anyway, after the U.S.-backed coup in 2014, Russia took Crimea back because it didn't want to risk the prospect of its most important naval base falling into the hands of a neo-Nazi nationalist coup regime that was talking about joining NATO. So Russia took Crimea, and ever since then, neoconservatives like Newland have been fantasizing about getting it back. And so here's Newland now saying that we've approved Ukraine to hit Crimea and to try to take it back, and we're giving it the weapons that it needs. That's the takeaway from her comments in that clip there with Aaron David Miller.
Yeah, and I mean, I know people from Crimea, none of them wanted to be under the control of Kiev after the Maidan coup. that they were ethnically Russian and they wanted to be part of a neutral Ukraine that respected their culture and their language and their religion. And that's not what's happening now. But more substantially, if the U.S. assists Ukraine in attacking Crimea, that would be crossing the red line and moving us towards nuclear confrontation. That would be Russia's red line. There's no debate with the way that the Kremlin looks at Crimea and the way most Russians look at it is as a integral part of the Russian Federation. So this would be seen as an attack on Russian soil, and this war is existential for Russia. That's what we fear. And to have this sociopathic neocon Nurse Ratched figure who's married to Bob Kagan make these comments should really signal to us how serious the threat of escalation is. So with that, I think it's time to wrap. And if you want to watch Aaron at Jimmy Dore, host Jimmy Dore, that's what, 15 minutes from now?
Yeah. And Max, listen, like to your point about how this risk and escalation, let me quote from that New York Times article I mentioned, where this was first disclosed that the U.S. is considering giving Ukraine the weapons it needs to hit Crimea. After months of discussion with Ukrainian officials, the Biden administration is finally starting to concede that Kiev may need the power to strike the Russian sanctuary, even if such a move increases the risk of escalation. So they're consciously aware that giving Ukraine weapons to hit Crimea could even escalate this horrible war even more. But they're saying, let's go for it. Why not? That's basically what they're saying. What they're counting on is that Putin won't use nuclear weapons. That's also the takeaway from this article.
Indeed. Well, thanks everyone for being with us for another Friday stream at the Grayzone, and we'll be back in a week. As I said, check out Aaron 15 minutes from now on Jimmy Dore. I will be speaking at No to NATO tomorrow, along with Anya Parampil. The stream starts at 11 a.m. Eastern time, which I guess is something like 4 p.m. London time. Sorry we couldn't be there, but there'll be future
Hey, Max, let me
events.
shout out Anya quickly. Anya gave a great speech at the Rage Against the War Machine rally, and I especially am grateful to her for shouting out Scott Ritter, who was not able to speak, but I think he deserved to speak. He's sacrificed a lot to challenge militarism in this country and is very informed about the Ukraine war, and Anya gave him credit. I thought that was a great move. So thank you, Anya, for doing that.
Great speech. I support that message. I support everything she said and everything she subsequently said on Twitter. So put that in your pipe and smoke it, professional sectarian leftists. Well, this is anyway, we got to be out. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for supporting the Grayzone. We couldn't do it without you. We couldn't have had that rally without you. And we got to do more. So peace.